Maggie pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, bracing against the biting cold as she surveyed Eldon Hollow from her small cottage window. Snow blanketed the village, muting the sounds and softening the once familiar edges of her world. In winter, the village transformed into an eerie, quiet place where even the hardiest villagers rarely ventured far after dark. The snow seemed to consume everything's sounds, colors, warmth, leaving only silence and a peculiar sense of stillness. She sighed, her breath fogging the glass as she peered out at the darkening landscape. Stories floated around town every winter, whispers about ghostly figures in the woods and footsteps that appeared, only to vanish without a trace. The elders spoke of times when villagers would go missing in the dead of winter, led away by strange lights or eerie calls. Maggie had always dismissed the tales as superstitions, little fireside stories meant to keep children from wandering too far. But tonight, the silence weighed on her, thick and unnatural. She glanced at the hearth, the flames crackling softly, casting shadows across her small cottage. With a shiver, she pulled on her coat and stepped outside, hoping a short walk might clear her mind. Crunching through the fresh snow, Maggie's boots left deep, satisfying impressions. She wandered along the path leading toward the village center, where dim lanterns cast flickering light against the snow-covered buildings. But as she reached the edge of the path, something caught her eye, a single set of footprints leading away from the village into the dense thicket of trees beyond. Maggie frowned. She knelt down, inspecting the footprints more closely. They were small, almost like a child's. The impressions were fresh, unburied by any new snowfall, meaning they couldn't be more than an hour old. Her stomach tightened. It wasn't unusual for children to play in the snow, but at this hour, and in such freezing weather, the village children were usually safe at home by now. Instinct urged her to turn back, but something, a flicker of curiosity mixed with concern, compelled her to follow the tracks. Taking a deep breath, she tightened her scarf and began to walk, her steps mirroring the strange little footprints before her. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the snow became deeper and the trees thicker. The world outside the village felt like a different realm altogether, one ruled by shadows and silence. Her footsteps echoed slightly, a rhythmic crunch that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness. Maggie's mind drifted to the stories she had heard growing up, whispers about spirits that roamed the woods, their footsteps silent, their eyes watching from the trees. The tracks wound around twisted roots and snow-covered stones, leading her farther from the safety of the village lights. Shadows flitted between the trees, and Maggie began to feel as though she wasn't alone. Every now and then, she'd pause, listening, swearing she heard faint whispers carried by the wind. As she continued, the air grew colder, biting her skin even through her thick coat. Her pulse quickened, and her curiosity began to shift into unease. She glanced back, but the path she'd taken was already obscured by falling snow. She was alone, with nothing but her thoughts and those faint footprints to guide her. Eventually, the trees parted, revealing a small figure standing motionless in the snow, her back turned to Maggie. It was a young girl, her thin frame outlined against the gray twilight. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She stepped forward cautiously, the crunch of her boots breaking the silence. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The girl turned around slowly, her pale face framed by tangled dark hair. She couldn't have been older than 8 or 9, yet there was something unsettlingly timeless about her gaze, a depth of sadness in her eyes that seemed to pierce straight through Maggie. "Are you lost?" Maggie asked, feeling a sudden surge of protectiveness despite the odd sensation prickling at her skin. The girl, Anna, nodded silently. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as if she'd been waiting in the snow for a long time. Maggie knelt down, trying to meet her gaze. "What's your name?" "Anna," the girl whispered, barely audible over the soft rustle of the trees. Maggie forced a reassuring smile. "It's too cold to be out here alone, Anna. Where's your family?" Anna looked away, her lips trembling as if she wanted to answer, but couldn't find the words. Maggie noticed the girl's clothes, thin, worn, and clearly not suited for winter. How had she made it this far? Something wasn't right. She took Anna's hand, feeling how cold it was, almost as if she'd been outside for hours. "Come on, let's get you home," Maggie said, trying to sound calm. As they set off on the path back to the village, Maggie's relief at leaving the eerie cabin was quickly overtaken by an unsettling feeling that crept up her spine. The forest, once a familiar place, now seemed hostile and foreign. The trees were denser than she remembered, their twisted branches stretching out over the path like skeletal fingers reaching for something or someone. They cast elongated shadows across the snow, dark streaks that seemed to flicker and shift in the fading light, creating shapes that Maggie's mind couldn't quite decipher. Each shadow looked like it might conceal something lurking, watching, just beyond her sight. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the snow-covered ground. But the more they walked, the more Maggie became convinced that their own steps weren't the only ones echoing through the woods. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her gaze darting between the trees. But each time she looked, the forest remained still. And yet, the prickling sensation of being watched wouldn't leave her. Every so often, she'd hear a faint sound, the soft crack of a branch, the murmur of wind that almost sounded like whispers. It sent chills through her, as if someone or something was following, hidden in the shadows just beyond her line of sight. Anna walked silently at her side, her small hand gripping Maggie's, her gaze fixed intently on the path ahead. The girl's calm, steady demeanor only added to Maggie's growing paranoia. She seemed to know the way with uncanny precision, never hesitating or faltering. It was as though the woods were more familiar to her than they were to Maggie, even though Maggie had spent her whole life in the village. Trying to calm her own nerves, Maggie decided to break the silence. "Do you live near here, Anna?" she asked, hoping that a bit of conversation might dispel the dread that was building inside her. Her voice felt thin and fragile in the oppressive quiet of the forest. Anna shook her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "I used to," she replied softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Maggie felt her heart skip a beat, a wave of cold creeping over her. She wanted to ask more, to understand what Anna meant, but something about the girl's tone stopped her. It was the way she'd said it, like someone who carried memories too painful to voice. There was a weight to her words, a sadness that seemed far older than her years, and Maggie felt an instinctive urge to leave the rest of Anna's story buried in silence. The air between them thickened, filled with the unspoken and the unknown. Each step seemed to press them deeper into the growing gloom, the path winding in ways that felt unfamiliar, as if the forest itself was shifting around them. The once clear route back to the village now seemed fraught with shadows that twisted and lengthened, stretching to surround them. The further they walked, the darker the woods grew, the silence more oppressive, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Maggie tightened her grip on Anna's hand, her fingers icy despite the warmth of the little girl's palm. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her senses were on high alert, picking up every sound, every shift in the shadows. She could no longer shake the feeling that something was out there, watching them from the depths of the forest. An ancient, unseen presence that had perhaps witnessed countless travelers pass through, but only some return. In the stifling silence, her mind filled with questions she dared not voice, each one lingering as they made their way through the darkening woods. Maggie felt trapped in an endless loop of fear and uncertainty, as though the woods themselves were refusing to let them leave. The forest path seemed to stretch on forever, and Maggie wondered, with a rising sense of dread, if they would ever find their way out. Just as Maggie was beginning to wonder if they'd strayed too far from the village, the faint outline of a structure came into view through the dense trees. A cabin, half buried in snow, loomed ahead, its wooden frame warped and leaning, as if struggling to remain upright. Vines and thick underbrush wove around it, concealing much of its exterior and giving it the appearance of something that nature itself was trying to reclaim. Maggie felt a strange pull of curiosity mingled with unease, but she would have turned back if Anna hadn't gripped her hand even tighter, tugging her forward with a surprising, almost urgent strength. As they approached, the eerie quiet of the woods seemed to thicken around them. The cabin's windows were shattered, leaving dark, hollow spaces that stared out like empty eyes. The front door hung slightly ajar, its rusted hinges straining under the weight of years of neglect. Maggie took a deep breath, the frigid air stinging her lungs, and pushed open the door, which creaked in protest before swinging open to reveal the interior. Inside, the cabin was cloaked in shadow, the dim light from outside barely penetrating the dust-coated windows. Maggie blinked, letting her eyes adjust, and took in the unsettling scene. Cobwebs stretched across the ceiling beams and clung to the walls, while layers of dust coated the sparse furniture, undisturbed for what looked like decades. Shelves along one wall were filled with yellowed, crumbling books, and the faint, sickly sweet smell of rot hung in the stale air, mingling with the cold. In the far corner, a rocking chair sat facing the doorway, its wooden frame worn and cracked. To Maggie's shock, the chair swayed gently, creaking softly as though someone had just risen from it moments before. She swallowed, a shiver racing down her spine as the silence seemed to press closer, heavy with the feeling of being watched. Yet, there was no one, only the shadows and the relentless quiet of the abandoned cabin. Anna stepped inside with an unsettling confidence, her gaze unwavering as she crossed the room. Maggie hesitated, her feet feeling rooted to the floor, but then she followed, drawn by Anna's strange, silent urgency. On a small table near the rocking chair, something caught Maggie's eye, a faded photograph lying amid the dust. Anna's gaze was locked on it, her face a mask of sadness and longing. Maggie approached, her heart pounding as she took in the image. The photograph was worn and faded, the edges curled and frayed. It showed a young girl standing outside the very cabin they now stood in, her small figure bundled in winter clothes, her expression somber and hauntingly familiar. Maggie's eyes widened in shock as she realized the girl was Anna, her likeness captured as though frozen in time, identical to the girl now standing beside her. 1,000 questions flooded Maggie's mind, but words failed her. She managed only a whispered, "Anna, how is this possible?" Anna's expression shifted, her face reflecting a sadness that seemed too deep, too ancient for a child. Her hand reached out, hovering over the photograph, fingers trembling as though she were afraid to touch it. "I didn't mean to stay," she murmured, barely audible. Her voice was laced with regret, as though she'd been carrying a heavy burden in silence for years. Maggie felt a wave of sorrow and confusion, mingling with the cold dread that had settled in her bones. She wanted to ask more, to understand, but she could sense that Anna's sadness ran deeper than words could capture. It was as if this cabin, this frozen, forgotten place, held more than just the echoes of the past. It held Anna's lost spirit, tethered by something unseen yet unbreakable. Maggie's fingers trembled as she reached for the photograph. It lay hidden beneath a layer of dust, as though forgotten by time itself. The edges of the picture were yellowed and brittle, threatening to disintegrate at her touch. She held it carefully, brushing off the dust with her thumb, and peered down at the faded image, her heart hammering as her eyes adjusted to the details. The photograph showed a young girl standing in front of the cabin, surrounded by the same snow-laden woods. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the girl's face, the round cheeks, the wide, curious eyes, the slight turn of her lips that hinted at a shy smile. It was unmistakably Anna. But it wasn't just the girl's face that sent a chill down Maggie's spine, it was her clothes. Every detail of Anna's outfit in the photograph matched what she wore now, down to the small, jagged tear on the hem of her dress. The realization washed over her in an icy wave, leaving her rooted to the spot. Maggie's mind raced, struggling to make sense of the discovery. How could Anna look exactly the same? The photograph was clearly old, its edges worn and frayed. But the Anna she knew, the Anna who had appeared to her, fragile and lost in the snow, was dressed as if she had stepped straight out of this photograph and into the present. A distant, sorrowful whisper floated through the room, barely audible but unmistakably Anna's voice. "I didn't mean to stay, but I couldn't find my way back." The words drifted like a mournful echo, each syllable heavy with regret and loss, as though Anna herself were speaking from a place beyond time. Maggie shuddered, her skin prickling with the weight of the realization that had begun to settle within her. It wasn't just that Anna was lost, she was trapped here, bound to the cabin and the endless, snow-covered woods. Maggie could sense it now, a sadness that seemed to permeate the very walls of the cabin, a lingering grief etched into every beam and corner. Anna had been wandering, alone and unseen, for who knew how many years, her spirit tethered to this isolated place. Maggie's heart ached with a fierce, sudden sorrow, an overwhelming empathy for this child who had been caught in a timeless loop, endlessly seeking something she could no longer find. Maggie stumbled back, pressing a hand to her mouth as the weight of the truth pressed down on her. She imagined Anna's last moments, lost and cold, unable to find her way back to the warmth of the village. That sense of isolation, of longing, seemed to linger in the air around her, as though Anna's presence had seeped into the wood and stone of the cabin itself. Maggie wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but the sound caught in her throat, choked by the grief and empathy that had overtaken her. The photograph slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. As it landed, Maggie felt a surge of determination rise within her. She couldn't leave Anna to wander alone, not anymore. If she had come this far, then perhaps she could help Anna finally find peace, release her from the haunting embrace of the woods and the cabin. Maggie's heart raced as she looked up to see a dark figure standing in the doorway. It was massive, shadowy, and undefined, as though it were a creature formed from pure darkness. Its edges wavered, shifting as though made of smoke, but its eyes were unsettlingly clear, a pair of faintly glowing orbs that cut through the dim light with an eerie, penetrating gaze. Maggie instinctively reached for Anna, pulling her behind her. She could feel the cold, creeping dread radiating from the figure, a feeling that seemed to seep into her bones. It didn't move, but she sensed its intent, an undeniable force that spoke of ancient sadness and anger. It felt like standing in the presence of a powerful storm, with a deep, ancient sorrow wrapped tightly around it. This figure wasn't merely a shadow, it was the essence of the wood's isolation, of lost souls, of something that had been waiting for years, feeding on the silence. Maggie wanted to turn, to run, to drag Anna back to the village where they might be safe. But as she looked down, she realized Anna was no longer gripping her hand tightly. Instead, the girl had released her grasp and was stepping forward, moving towards the dark entity. There was a sadness in Anna's eyes, but also a glimmer of determination, a mix of acceptance and courage that Maggie hadn't seen before. The little girl, who had appeared so fragile and frightened moments before, now seemed strong, resolute, as though she knew exactly what she was doing. "I'm ready," Anna said, her voice calm, almost relieved. Her tone echoed around the room, steady and unwavering. Maggie's heart twisted with a surge of protective fear. She wanted to pull Anna back, to shout, to do anything to keep her from walking toward this shadowy figure. Yet something held her back, an unexplainable force that seemed to tell her this was Anna's choice, her path. The figure's shadowy form extended, stretching toward Anna. Its arms, or perhaps tendrils, reached out, slowly enveloping her in an embrace that was neither violent nor tender, but was instead something timeless, like a memory finally finding peace. Maggie watched, frozen, tears streaming down her cheeks as Anna's outline began to fade, her small body blurring until it became part of the darkness surrounding her. For a brief moment, Maggie thought she saw a soft smile on Anna's lips, a faint expression of gratitude and relief, as though she was finally free of whatever had kept her here for so long. And then, in an instant, Anna was gone, her spirit vanishing into the silence. The cabin, now empty, felt different. The air seemed lighter, as though a long-held tension had been released. And for the first time, Maggie noticed the stillness, the kind of quiet that follows a long-awaited resolution. She stood in the doorway, looking at the empty room, trying to process what she'd just witnessed. Her hands trembled, and she felt a strange mix of sadness and peace washing over her. It was as if the cabin itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for this moment. And now that Anna was gone, it had finally exhaled. Maggie stumbled out into the cold night, the snow crunching beneath her feet as she stepped away from the cabin. She felt hollow and heavy, burdened by a profound sadness for Anna and for whatever life she had lost in this lonely stretch of woods. Her mind replayed the girl's final smile, the look of peace on her face as she accepted her fate. Maggie clutched her coat tighter around her, each step back toward the village feeling like an eternity as she processed the haunting encounter. In the days that followed, Maggie found herself drawn back to the edge of the woods, her eyes searching for any sign of Anna. She would stand there in the snow, looking for footprints or a flicker of movement. But each time, she was met with only silence. The cabin remained empty, its doors shut, its windows dark, as though it had finally served its purpose and had nothing left to give. The footsteps in the snow, which had once led her into the mystery, never reappeared. Maggie eventually accepted that Anna's spirit had found peace, and the strange happenings in the woods ceased. But the memory lingered, a story she carried quietly within her heart, a reminder of the ghostly figure she had followed one winter's night, and the little girl who had found her way home at last.